Hello, everybody. Long-time viewers, listeners to the show know that I'm a huge admirer of Neil Postman's 1985 book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, Public Discourse in the Age of Show Business. Postman has a wonderful one-page introduction in which he suggests that we got 1984 wrong, that in 1984, at least in America, is not the year of George Orwell's dystopian 1984, but actually the dystopia of his English compatriot Aldous Huxley, whose 1932 book, Brave New World, lays out the dystopia of modernity. Huxley himself was a very interesting character, both a subject and an object, if you like, of drug addiction. And one of the most distinctive things about Brave New World is the centrality of soma, a fictional drug in which everyone, one way or the other, is hooked upon. My guest today has done a lot of thinking about drugs, power, and powerlessness. She has a new novel out called The Untended. It's about, in some ways, drug addiction in the 21st century. Mattea Kramer is joining us from New Hampshire. Mattea, are you familiar with Huxley's Brave New World?
I am, yes.
Do you think Postman was right? Do you think that the real dystopia of modernity is not 1984 with its political totalitarianism, but the more amorphous and difficult to nail down totalitarianism of Brave New World?
I think that the dystopianism of modernity, as you just pointed out, is a precursor for totalitarianism that's in 1984. So, in other words, yes, and I think that dystopia of modernity is a lack of meaning that people experience, and that pushes people toward needing something else, and drugs can be that something else.
As I said, you define yourself, at least according to your biography, as a writer about drugs. You contribute to all sorts of publications like The Nation. What is it about drugs that interest you, that make them so important, that you've chosen to write about? I'm going to come to the novel in a few minutes, but a lot of people will know you also as a nonfiction journalist.
Yeah, the topic of drugs came to my central attention because the small town that I'm from, Greenfield, Massachusetts, was really hard hit and remains hard hit by the opioid crisis. And in 2017 signed on to the lawsuits against the pharmaceutical companies. And at that point, I was both moved by the notion that my town, this tiny town, could be a part of tremendous action to hold the pharmaceutical companies to account, but also on the ground was suffering profoundly as a result of the influx of prescription drugs. And so at that time, I took up the subject as a journalist and wrote about it in nonfiction formats. But really, all along, I had this idea for a novel, or that it could be a novel. And so I was sort of testing the waters for a novel first by reporting on the subject as a journalist.
I wonder, Mattea, whether there's any truth. I've often thought this, although it's a rather a general observation, that, I mean, every country, of course, is prone to one kind of addiction or another, but there's something peculiar about America that lends itself to addiction. Of course, the history of prohibition. And these days we have the opioid crisis and many other legal and non-legal drug addictions. Is there something about America that makes itself perhaps more vulnerable to one kind of addiction or another?
Yes, I think that the pursuit of the myth of individualism is at the root of that fuels and is intertwined with capitalist pursuits. The pressure to be an individual success, to appear successful, to make lots of money, to have lots of things, separates us from one another, and therefore creates a sense of loneliness and absence. The absence being connection and community. And I think that leads us to search for something that can fill that void. And so I do think that there is something uniquely vulnerable about this American fabric that lends itself to addiction. And I don't just mean addiction to drugs. The addiction could be to work, to devices, television, shopping, gambling, sex, food. There, virtually anything can become the object of obsession and addiction in the absence of genuine connection and meaning and purpose in a person's life.
Speaking of addiction and loneliness, I know you wrote an interesting piece about loneliness, Donald Trump, and you. Are you suggesting that populist movements like MAGA might themselves be a feature of America's addictive personality?
Definitely. Yeah, that piece, I hope, takes a really human and empathetic perspective on what is oftentimes there's a cult of personality, of course, around Donald Trump. And I think that searching for hope and meaning in a leader is not new to 21st century America. That has happened over and over again throughout human history. We are in it right now in the US. There are other would-be dictators, of course, elsewhere in the US, elsewhere in the world. And that can be absolutely a drug. It can be intoxicating to imagine that this leader can bring us to greatness or bring us back to greatness, of course, as the catchphrase suggests. And that is addicting and a powerful fantasy.
So are you suggesting, Mattea, that the only antidote to addiction is community, or it's simply the most effective one?
I think the truest antidote to addiction is community. I think that there also have to be many other kinds of solutions. We're in a world today where the illicit drug supply, as well as the legal prescribed drug supply, is incredibly potent, and people overdose and die from substances that are procured, whether on the street or from a pharmacy. And overdoses can be reversed with naloxone. So, for example, that is one intervention and one antidote to a world that is awash in strong and often dangerous drugs. So, community, I believe, is the ultimate solution, connection to one another. And also, there are many other interventions, mental health care among them, that are crucial to respond to addiction and mental health crises.
And you've written in the past about, and I'm quoting the title of your piece, the gutting of America's mental health system. We'll maybe talk about that later. You mentioned capitalism earlier. The great book on the origins of American capitalism, or Puritan American capitalism, was, of course, Max Weber's analysis of the connection between Puritanism and its sort of the existential isolation of the believer from God and capitalism. Is the history of American capitalism and the history of American addiction, are they intertwined, hard to separate? And are they sort of somehow bound up in perhaps a history of existential uncertainty, which is not disassociated with religion itself, given that the foundations of the American Republic are indeed religious?
I think that the perpetual quest for more underlies both of the phenomena that you're talking about. So the American capitalism and the essence of America itself, and Puritanism, the quest for the individual achievement. And so I think the answer to that question is yes.
And of course, you're talking to me from New Hampshire, the heart of New England, where it all began.
Yes, I'm in Western Massachusetts, rural Western Massachusetts.
Or even more the heart of where it all began.
Yes, very much so. This region has been hard hit by the opioid crisis, and it's also in so many ways emblematic of rural working life, and also a place that I love dearly and I call home.
Are there any good drugs, Mattea? I mean, the drug that's been in the headlines recently is Ozempic. Celebrities are talking about how it helped them lose weight. Some people don't want to talk about them. But I wonder whether they are also addictive. They seem to be good for us in the sense that they make us healthier in theory, although there's a lot of debate about that. But is there such a thing in your view as a good drug or a good addiction?
This is such a great question, Andrew. I think that what makes something, the possibility of a good drug lies in the person's relationship with it. You can have a healthy relationship with a glass of wine, you can have an unhealthy relationship with a glass of wine. So I think that the answer is absolutely yes. There can be good drugs. And in some cases, I mean, you could, I think, probably make an intelligent case that almost any drug can be good in certain contexts. And some of the most powerful and most dangerous drugs can be used, for instance, in palliative care to ease pain for people who are dying. Just that's one example of many. So drugs can be incredibly useful. They can also, I also want to say, for instance, I use cannabis. I'm not afraid to say that. I think it's important to own the fact that I use drugs. I'm not talking about people who use drugs as some other population, not at all. And I think that we all have our drugs, whether it's a TV show or a glass of wine or a glass of bourbon or any other substance. We all
Even a
have.
podcast show.
What's that?
Even a podcast show.
We all have
I hope
our.
people are addicted to this. I know you have your own podcast show. I mean, thinking about Ozempic, Mattea, one of the things that's interesting to me about it as a drug and the sort of the American experience of addiction is that there's ambivalence about people acknowledging they're taking it, because losing weight was always hard. It was always a kind of puritanical endeavor. It required very significant willpower. And now you can just do it by taking drugs. So there's a degree of ambivalence about that. What's the relationship then between, excuse me, willpower and drugs, both in a good and a bad way? And, you know, this idea of willpower, of course, which is perhaps a reflection of your more atomized America, might also be seen either in a positive or negative light.
Nail on the head right there. I think that we glorify willpower and imagine that people who use drugs lack it and therefore are less than. And I would take issue with that whole frame and say that willpower need not be the focus of adulation. Sometimes willpower is useful. Sometimes just taking tender care of oneself and each other is what's needed, and willpower is irrelevant. And that might mean taking medicine that you feel ambivalent about. And the weight loss drug is a particularly interesting case, I would say, because what underlies that, of course, is a glorification of being thin in a culture that is fat phobic. And if instead we lived in a world in which there was some degree of body neutrality, would we be pursuing this drug at all? So I think stepping back and looking at the context in which people are pursuing a given drug is the way to bring insight to the issue.
Is there a class component here too? Overweight seems to be a particular feature of the American working class as opposed to the upper class, even if Americans are sometimes uncomfortable using those terms.
Absolutely. The healthiest foods are the most expensive in the world that we live in today. The time to go to the gym and to work on, to belong to a gym, to work on your body, to recreate versus working jobs and schedules and consuming food that are really detrimental to the body and can lead to obesity. The answer is an overwhelming yes.
You've written quite emotionally about your relations with your grandmother, with your father. Do you have a history of drugs and drug addiction in your family, either with yourself or with relatives?
I don't have a history of the kind of drug addiction that I write about in The Untended, which focuses on illicit drugs and, in particular, heroin. Do I have a history of addiction in my family? I would say yes. And I think that my family's particular addiction is quintessentially American, Andrew. And it's the addiction to feeling special and successful. And it's hugely damaging. It is present in my family intergenerationally, and I see it harming my generation as it has my parents' generation. And in my life, I've only seen it come through my grandparents' generation. It might go back further. I don't know. But there's absolutely an addiction at play, and it's devastating.
How do you write a novel about addiction as a novelist and also kind of try to, given you're aware of this and presumably don't want to get sucked into it, and remain independent of that addiction? After all, if you write a novel, you want it to sell, you want to become the next big novelist.
What an insightful question. It's very tricky. And I think that a good comparison is people whose addiction it has to do with food, or for instance, people who experience an eating disorder like anorexia. You can never get away from your problem substance. You must eat to live. And to be a human in the world, we are constant. So like there's no escaping this the any number of triggers for wanting to feel like a special or successful person here in modern 21st century America. And writing a novel, of course, is in part a bid for attention. You want people to read the novel. And
Yeah, it's your shot at immortality. Many people are called. There are lots of people who think they have a novel in them and don't write them. Some of them end up writing them. Very few of them get them published. So you're already in the top 1.5%.
It's so funny. You're hitting on something very profound, and I have not resolved this. I feel authentically drawn to tell this story. I told it in what felt to me like a very alive creative collaboration with the main character, who is of course fictional. And I'm very proud. I worked on the book for 8 years and feel authentically proud in a way that doesn't have to do with simply ego. And yet, when the book receives any attention, or I get a positive review or so forth, it does fire that part of my brain. And it's like, oh, I want more of that.
Well, you're getting it today with me. You've written extensively about what one review of your book called The Cost of Addiction. As you said, you've written extensively about the American health system, about loneliness, about opioid justice. You could have written a nonfiction book, of course, which probably would have taken less than 8 years and I'm guessing would have been easier to sell. Why did you choose this fictional form?
I think it chose me. And I think that a lot of novelists would say the same thing, that an idea arrives and you become enchanted with it, if not obsessed with it, if not addicted to it. And I think I fell in love with this concept and ultimately with the characters of this book, who I hold so dearly. And now to see them out in the world, now truly having their own life and readers having their own relationship with the characters, this idea and this vision of this story just manifested, came to me, or unfolded, unraveled as I wrote and wrote and wrote and revised and cut. And that was the reason it had to be fiction.
I'm guessing it must be incredibly hard to describe addiction. It's one thing to write about the opioid industry or then the dysfunctionality of American healthcare. It's quite another to describe what it's like to be addicted. Did you have models? Are there great writers, American writers in particular, who inspired you to do this? Who you thought, wow, these guys can do it. I'm going to learn from them.
I actually feel that many, if not most, of the portrayals of addiction in literature do a disservice to the people who are experiencing the the disease, because I often feel like it's written about without recognition of the underlying humanity. And so what I did, Andrew, is I approached the topic the way a journalist would, and I interviewed and interviewed and interviewed. And the the stories and descriptions that I learned while interviewing people became the substance of my description of the arc of addiction, which this book covers from the first taste of an incredibly powerful substance all the way through to the other side, wherever that may lead. And it was the nonfiction, the journalistic research that informed my writing about that experience, as opposed to models from fictional literature.
Is it all compounded in America by the fact that, of course, addiction can be defined in terms of being addicted to a particular substance, thing, or activity by a lack of self-control? And of course, the promise, the idea of agency is the essence of American culture, of freedom, of democracy. So is there something particularly shaming about addiction, did you find, in terms of talking to addicts in America?
Absolutely. The stigma associated with addiction is so strong, including in an internalized sense, that people who have experienced addiction feel a sense of being less than other people.
Failure,
And
essentially. Failed.
absolutely. And even, I mean, even the term addict, I think obscures the truth of it, which to me, I think what we're saying when we say the word addict, we're saying a person who has experienced addiction. And that, to me, that phrase is so much more telling, so much more illustrative of what we're actually talking about, because it evokes the humanity and the arc of suffering that is part of this disease and this experience. And so I have encountered a great deal of stigma in writing about this subject in a fictional way. And it's interesting. And I have, in the course of my work on this subject, become friends with people who research and study addiction from a scientific lens. And the stigma affects everybody who works on the topic. So, for instance, I have a friendship with a researcher, Nancy Campbell, who's at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. She's a science historian. She wrote a book called Naloxone: The History of Overdose. She's brilliant. And she finds that people say, why would you devote your life to this subject? And so there's this secondary stigma that attaches to people who focus on the subject and bring empathy to it.
Are there alternative ways of thinking about quote unquote addiction? We've done some shows on indigenous Americans' relations with the land and perhaps with addiction, and with certain sorts of what we call drugs, or impacts of consequences of drugs. When you compare America to other societies, can we look more positively? Can we find alternative models?
Absolutely. I think just thinking about it as part of a continuum of mental health and health issues, it's not separate from, it doesn't have to be stigmatized and siloed. If a friend of yours has cancer, you don't blame them, of course. You don't imagine that treating them with love and care when they're undergoing cancer treatment would be enabling the cancer. It's ludicrous to even suggest that. So just bringing the experience of addiction into the fold with every other kind of human experience and every other kind of mental health issue and health issue in general is a completely different frame, and there's no need to bring judgment or stigma to the experience, and at the same time to embrace, for each of us to embrace the ways that we all have our own personal intimate addictions. And so a few minutes ago I was talking about that addiction to feeling special and successful, and it could be anything. It could be an addiction to work. It could be an addiction to your phone. We don't have to isolate the notion of addiction to substances. And I think actually we learn a lot about ourselves and about humanity if we bring all of these things together and look at ourselves in the process.
I mean, the way you're presenting addiction is almost inevitable, unavoidable, a feature of what it is to be human. In Brave New World, Soma was prescribed by the states. There was a kind of state-sponsored drug regime, so to speak. What is your feeling on that? Might it be worthwhile for the government to give out drugs that are, if not addictive, certainly have the impact of something like Soma, so it would do away with the stigma?
No, I don't think I'm not attempting to say that addiction is inevitable in general, but I think that, again, your phrase from the beginning of the show, the dystopia of modernity, I think that in our modern world where we're so isolated, we're in the pursuit of more money, more things, just trying to get by. I think that in that particular context in which so many people are exploited in so many different ways, and economic exploitation is a main thread throughout this novel, The Untended. I think in that context, addiction becomes nearly unavoidable, regardless of what substance specifically we're talking about. I would not endorse the government handing out a drug like that. No.
Your novel takes place in New England, in a small town. The small town America has, of course, been ravaged not just by drugs, by many other things, by globalization, by all sorts of economics. One of the reasons it seems that Trump's so popular in this country, or why at least he's president. When one goes to one of these small towns, when one drives through Mattea, might one see in the damage to these towns, in the absence of community, in the destruction of Main Street, the damage of addiction in one kind or another?
Yeah, I think we do see the damage of addiction. It's more obvious maybe than the damages of other kinds of things. I mean, one of the topics of the book, or that comes through ultimately in this novel, is how powerful and moneyed interests extract money and labor from those who are at the bottom of the economic pyramid, and extract money and wealth from the natural world. And so we see towns are ravaged by addiction. Yes, they're also perhaps more significantly ravaged by late stage American capitalism.
If you really want to see what you call late stage American capitalism, probably don't need me to tell you this. You come to my town, San Francisco, which is made up of enormously wealthy people living in huge homes worth many millions of dollars. And then these kind of drug apartheid little communities, and they're not communities, they're anti-communities of ravaged people lying around the street. It's the other side of the small town America. What would you make? I'm not sure if you've spent any time in San Francisco. What can or should we make of these dual truths of America? On the one hand, the beautiful wealthy of Silicon Valley in their San Francisco mansions. On the other hand, this underclass of people literally lying around the streets, self-evidently addicted to drugs, and no one really doing much to control them.
I think the thing to do is to remember the humanity of the people who are relegated to that underclass and whose life circumstances have led them to be physically in a gutter and incapacitated. Every single one of those people was once a newborn baby deserving of the same love and care that all humans deserve. And their life circumstances have brought them to where they are. And remembering that they are human beings and have their own dreams and hopes just the same as whoever is walking down the street and viewing them, and just the same as the folks who are in their Silicon Valley mansions and towers and so forth. I think remembering the humanity and seeing the humanity in one another is what we are called to do now.
Yeah, and we've done a number of shows, a number of activists, especially homeless activists, have written about this. Your book, Mattea, the heroine is a waitress, a single mom. Is there a gendered quality? I mean, there obviously is a gendered quality in the novel, but when it comes to addiction, and men and women, are they more or less vulnerable to different kinds of addictions, or is that the wrong way of thinking about it?
Yeah, I don't think that men and women alike, people of all genders, are vulnerable to addictions and certainly vulnerable to powerful painkillers that help them feel better than they have ever gotten to feel in their entire life. This book, I was particularly interested in writing about a female character experiencing addiction just because I have not encountered many fictional portrayals of women as the protagonist of a really gritty and true kind of story about illicit drugs and the journey through it.
I'm not sure if you've got kids. I do. I'm guessing the heroine of your book is uh, a waitress and a single mother. There's something particularly shaming about being an addict and a parent at the same time. Is that fair?
That's such a good point. Yes, absolutely. The sense of failure that you mentioned a few minutes ago is amplified by 1,000. The sense of shame amplified over and over. It's makes it, and shame actually makes it all the harder to regain your footing when you're experiencing a mental illness, mental health episode. The sense of shame makes it harder to reach out to connect with other people, to ask for help, to just ask for support. And that's what we need the most when we're in a crisis, of course, and certainly in this particular kind of crisis. So it just makes it all the harder and layers on the sense of blame and shame.
And there's something unnatural about it in the sense that it almost forces the child to become the parent and the parent to become the child.
There is a great deal of that in our world today, and that evokes the title of the book, The Untended. The opioid crisis created such intergenerational trauma in exactly the frame you're talking about, Andrew, in which children are left untended when parents are experiencing addiction. And that perpetuates new trauma as those children grow up and have babies of their own. They are harmed, and in so many cases unhealed from their original trauma. So you're raising a really important point.
Yeah, and that perhaps, I mean, I don't want to generalize about J.D. Vance, but he came out of this kind of community. And perhaps his, it seems to me at least, self evident absence of humanity might be one of the consequences of his experience.
What I'll say about JD Vance is he has taken his Yale Law School education and done what he was educated to do.
What do you mean by that?
That he was that he took on the mantle of waging elitism under the banner of um, his early life experiences, as if that gave him a sense of rightness about it, and he has done the worst that one can imagine, that I can imagine.
Yeah, I don't think you'll find many people disagreeing with you on that one. Certainly, people listen to the show. Finally, Mattea, the American narrative, of course, is of happy endings. Most people assume that novels have happy endings. I'm not sure I want you to give away the ending of your book, The Untended, because we want people to read it. But is there a happy ending when it comes to this broader conversation? Can we get beyond this terrible crisis that America is currently in without some dramatic revolution against what you call postmodern or late stage capitalism, which might work in theory, but in practice is incredibly hard?
I think what gives me hope is the notion that each of us has the power to reach out and connect with other people. Each of us has the power to encounter a person who's unhoused on the street and to look them in the eye and to see their humanity. We each have the power to reach out to loved ones who are struggling. We have the power to be caring and loving, even when this harsh world invites us to be cynical and to try to just get our own. And that does feel hopeful to me, even in the midst of what I certainly believe are very difficult times.
In other words, the power of agency, Mattea, both in the best and the worst way. I mean, it's certainly problematic in some ways, but ultimately it's the way out of this too.
That's right.
Moral agency rather than perhaps financial or egotistical agency.
That's exactly right. Moral agency at a time and a moment in history that really asks it of us.
Well, Mattea Kramer, the author of The Untended, very intriguing new novel about addiction in a small town in New England. Congratulations on the book. It took 8 years, so everyone has a responsibility. Go out and buy it and see what they think themselves. Congratulations, Mattea, on the book, and keep doing your excellent nonfiction reporting too. Thank you so much.